So this video is called Prophetic Signs Associated with the Assassination of Charlie Kirk. So we have this tragic event that happened on September 10th, 2025, where political activist Charlie Kirk, who founded an organization called Turning Point USA, nonprofit organization, was killed, shot by an assassin from a rooftop. The suspect in that case is Tyler Robinson. He's alleged to have done this. Obviously, he's innocent until proven guilty. So we have this tragic event. Now, Charlie went around to college campuses debating students, letting them speak their minds. Then he tried to counter some of their arguments with his conservative political views and beliefs. But Charlie Kirk was also a man of faith. He was not shy about sharing his belief in Jesus Christ, his testimony as a Christian as well. And so in this video, speaking of testimony, I believe Charlie Kirk's death, his assassination, is prophetic, foreshadowing, I should say, is prophetically foreshadowing some events that will happen in the near future. And it relates to witnessing and witnesses. I think Charlie Kirk's death is symbolic of the death of the two witnesses in Revelation 11, and also symbolic of hostility towards God's two witnesses on earth, the greater witnesses of the church and Israel. All right, so let's look at several ways which I think this is seen. The first way is associated with the date he was killed, 9/10 of 2025. Because the next day, the suspect, Tyler Robinson, turned himself in, and that was 9/11. So we have a direct tie to the date of 9/11 here. And if you've seen some of my other videos, you know that I believe 9/11, the events of, I'm talking about 9/11/2001, the terror attacks, specifically the destruction of the Twin Towers, was prophetic foreshadowing of several different things. First, it was prophetic foreshadowing of the two witnesses of Revelation 11, because there's two towers and there's two witnesses, and the two towers were destroyed and the two witnesses will be killed. And that's in chapter 11, and we're talking about 9/11, and there's a bunch of 11s associated with 9/11. The number 11 is a number of witnessing, because in Judaism, the 11th hour of the day is either the hour before sunrise or sunset. So then in general, I think that the Twin Towers destruction on 9/11 of 2001 is also symbolic of the more general witnesses of the church and Israel. Those are God's two witnesses on earth, right? The church has been around for 2,000 years. The Israelites and the Israelite nations, and now the modern day of Israel, have been around even longer. But they're witnesses because they receive God's truth, God's light, and then share it. So in the case of the Israelites, they got the prophets, they wrote the scriptures, and that's witnessing to God's truth. In the case of the church, we have an indwelling of the Holy Spirit. Obviously, we can receive that light, receive that knowledge from God, information, truth, and then we share it. We share the gospel of Jesus Christ. We're supposed to witness for the gospel. So the church is a witness, and Israel's a witness. It's prophetic of two witnesses of the church and Israel having hostility against them as we approach the end times. And we're already seeing it to a degree. And of course, in Revelation 12, Satan, the dragon, he goes after the woman, who is symbolic of Israel. He also goes after those who hold to the testimony of Jesus Christ. And it's no surprise that the two groups on earth that the devil hates the most are the nation of Israel and faithful Christians, right? Okay. I also think that Twin Towers destruction could also point to the fall of Babylon. Fallen is Babylon the Great. It's mentioned twice, and two towers were destroyed. You have the Tower of Babel that was also in chapter 11, this time of the book of Genesis. So that's the third thing, but we're not going to concentrate on that one right now. But Charlie's death from the date simply of 9/10 and then the suspect turning himself in on 9/11. That's one tie into 9/11, which is tied in with this idea of witnesses. So we're talking about the church in Israel as two witnesses relating to 9/11, Charlie Kirk's death by date associated with 9/11. Now, Charlie's last name, Kirk, means church in Scottish. And I believe Jonathan Cahn in a video had already brought that up in his video, but I noticed it as soon as the news was out. I immediately I knew the last name Kirk meant church, so that just struck me right from the start. But yes, Jonathan Cahn had that, so I guess great minds think alike. But actually, of course, it's the Holy Spirit that leads us to discover these things and see these things. But I think it's significant that his name means church because, we're talking about church is one of the witnesses, and we're tying it into 9/11, and the Twin Towers stand for the church in Israel. So there's another tie-in with Charlie's death. But there's something else interesting going on because we can tie Charlie's murder to, and Charlie Kirk in general, to the other witness, Israel. Right? So we're talking about attacks on the two witnesses that are happening now and will happen in the future, the church and Israel. Hostility toward them increasing. So the way Charlie is associated with Israel, one way, is that Charlie Kirk's 32nd birthday would have been October 14th, 2025. On the Jewish calendar, that date was Shemini Atzeret. Until sundown, I apologize if my pronunciation was not great. That holy day falls immediately after the Feast of Tabernacles, the 7 days of the Feast of Tabernacles, which is also called Sukkot, or the Feast of Booths, the last festival of the high holy days of the month of Tishri. So there's a special 8th day that's added on to the end of Tabernacles. It's indicated in the Bible. I'll put that scripture on the screen. But God commands the Israelites to have a special assembly on that day, the 8th day. So there's an extra day. And that day falls on the 22nd of the month of Tishri. And a big part of that day is what's called Simchat Torah, where it's the cycle of the Torah reading ends on that day. So that's the end of the Torah reading for the year, and the cycle starts again. Outside of Israel, this is actually 2 days. That's not important. So Charlie Kirk's birthday on the Jewish calendar was this special day, the 22nd of Tishri, Shemini Atzeret. Why is that significant? Because on the Jewish calendar, Shemini Atzeret, the 22nd of Tishri, in 2023, 2 years earlier, was the date that Hamas went into Israel and massacred 1,200 approximately Israeli civilians. They killed people. They killed children in front of their parents. They kidnapped people. They kidnapped babies. They kidnapped old people. And they held some of those people for years. Some of them died in captivity. Some of them were recently freed. It was a horrible event. But that happened on this day, the 22nd of Tishri, 2023, Shemini Atzeret. Well, in 2025, that fell on October 14th, Charlie Kirk's 32nd birthday, or what would have been his 32nd birthday. That ties Charlie to hostility towards one of the witnesses, Israel. So his name means church, and his birthday is associated with hostility towards Israel. So I think we've determined here that Charlie Kirk seems to have a prophetic connection to the church in Israel and attacks on the church and Israel, attacks on believers in Jesus, attacks on the nation of Israel and the Jewish people. So we can actually tie Charlie Kirk's murder to the two witnesses of Revelation in another way. So after the two witnesses of Revelation 11 are murdered, their bodies lie in the street for 3.5 days, 3.5 days. After having witnessed for 3.5 years, consisting of those years consisting of 360 days each. That's called a prophetic year. 1260 days, 1260 days. And from their future deaths that will happen someday, to the return of Jesus with his bride, the bride of Christ, the believers, the faithful believers, will be another 3.5 years on this 360 day per year calendar. So the number 3.5 is indicated here. With all that in mind, there's something interesting about the timing of Charlie Kirk's death that relates to the number 3.5 or 3.5. First, some quick math. The average length of a month is 30.44 days. You get that by taking 365.25 divided by 12. Therefore, to find the length of 3.5 months, 3.5 months, you take 30.44 and times it by 3.5. And that comes to 106.54 days. So 106 to 107 days is 3.5 months. Is there a significant date we come to if we go 106 or 107 days from the date of Charlie Kirk's assassination on 9/10 of 2025? Yep. And that day is Christmas Day. So you see here, if you go from his death to Christmas Day and do not include the end date, it's 106 days. And then if you go from September 10th, 2025 to December 25th, 2025 and include the end date, it's 107 days. So it's 3.5 months, 3.5 months from Charlie Kirk's murder to what will be Christmas Day 2025, a day that the birth of Jesus is celebrated. Whether he was actually born on that day, a lot of people think he wasn't, and it's not important for our purposes here. It is the day that he's celebrated. It's associated with Jesus. And as I said, 3.5 years from the death of the two witnesses in Revelation 11 will be the return of Jesus with his bride. There's something interesting about the numbers 106 and 107 that we can tie back into 9/11, specifically the Twin Towers, which is just fascinating to me. On the 106th and 107th floor of the Twin Tower, known as the North Tower, the first tower, was what was called Windows on the World. It was an entertainment, dining, and meeting complex on those two floors. Like the 106th had like banquet rooms, meeting rooms. 107th had some restaurants and a bar, and you had good views there as well. It was called Windows on the World. So isn't that interesting? There was a special thing associated with the numbers 106 and 107 with one of the Twin Towers, and the Twin Towers can stand for witnesses, the two witnesses of Revelation 11, for example. And now we have these numbers 106 and 107 associated with Charlie Kirk's death if we go from his death to Christmas Day. And it's interesting that it doesn't exist anymore, obviously, Windows on the World. And what is a window? A window lets light in, right? Lets light in. That's one of the things a window does. What is a witness? A witness is somebody who receives the light of God, the truth of God, and then witnesses to that truth. But you can't witness to God unless you receive first. So the light has to come in. And what did Jesus say in the Bible? The eyes were the windows of the soul. And how many eyes do we have? We have 2 eyes. And we have 2 witnesses. We were talking about the idea of 2 witnesses. So a window is an interesting analogy for a witness. All right, and just to emphasize this point, in the Old Testament, God calls the Israelites on several occasions. One of them is in the book of Zechariah. He calls them the apple of his eye. And what is the apple of the eye? That is the pupil of the eye. What is the pupil? The pupil is the opening that lets light into the eye. So we're talking about windows, witnesses receiving light in, and we were talking about eyes. So we have this idea of the apple of the eye, the pupil. So how does the eye work? Well, light goes in through the pupil. It has to be reflected in the back of the eye. It has to be reflected. What does a witness do? They receive the light of God, and then they reflect it back out into the world. They share it with the world. So we talked about this. The Israelites had, right, the prophets, and they have the scriptures. The church, right, receives the light of God, receives the truth of God now. And we're supposed to reflect it back out into the world. The light, the love of God, the gospel of Jesus Christ. We're witnesses. God witnesses the church and Israel. So we get this idea. Jesus talks about the eyes being in the windows of the soul. The Old Testament talks about the pupil of the eye, witnesses. And now we have this windows on the world on the 106th and 107th floor of the old World Trade Center building, the North Tower, that was destroyed. And you see how it all ties together. The numbers 106 and 107 and windows and witnessing. It all ties together. So something else interesting with this number 107. And for this one, I'm going to go to Troy Brewer's book called Numbers That Prophecy. And this is a good book. I recommend people buying it and reading it. And Troy Brewer is a pastor of a church in Texas. He also wrote a book many years ago called Numbers That Preach. And I also recommend that book. That's a good resource to have about biblical numbers and their meanings. So he had an interesting thing with the number 107 concerning the Columbia disaster, space shuttle disaster of February 1st, 2003. And the number 107 comes from the mission number, which was STS 107. Now, he delves into many numbers and meanings with that mission, but I just want to focus on the number 107 because we've already seen it in our discussion or what I've been discussing so far. So in his book, he says number 107 stands for being found perfect. So being found perfect, or being found and then made perfect, perhaps by implication. He didn't go into the details of why that number meant that in his book that I could find, but I think it's because he's breaking it down into the numbers 10 and 7 out of 107, the number 10 being the number of order, perfect order, completeness, wholeness. 7's God's number. 7 is God's number of perfection, and it's the number most associated with God. So being found perfect, or being found and made perfect, perfected. And it's interesting that that kind of can go with the bride of Christ, which is the church, because we are found, and if we're found by God and perfected. And Jesus, of course, what Jesus does is purify his own bride with his blood. He purifies the bride so she is pure so that he can marry her. Okay. So it's interesting if you look at the number 10. The number 10 is associated with the bride of Christ. And I'll give you one example of that, and that's from the parable of the 10 virgins. Right? The 10 virgins were the wedding attendants of the bride. And you had 5 wise and 5 unwise. And that's 10. And I could go just in a quick, boy, that parable has so many layers of meaning. There's so much going on in that parable. But one of the things you can look at, you look at the human hand. There's 5 fingers on one hand and 5 fingers on the other hand, and having 2 hands, right? And the 5 end up being unwise, and they don't make it back when the groom comes. And we're talking about waiting for the groom, right? And so you have these 5 that are wise, and they meet up with the groom in the parable. And I'm just talking about the concept of a hand, and talking about being hand in hand in marriage, right? Hand in hand. So you have 5 fingers. You've shed the other 5, the unwise. They've been shed. The old has been shed, or something that needs to be gotten rid of is gotten rid of. And then you've got 5 left. But if those 5 fingers of a hand hold the hand of somebody else and are joined together in matrimony, then you've got 5 plus 5, that's 10, okay? So that's just a little something that's going on there. But there are other ways you can point that 10 is the number of the bride, but I won't go into it. So we got this number 107 with a 10 and a 7. So we're talking about the bride of Christ. And so what Troy Brewer pointed out in his book is that the commander of that fateful mission where 7 people died, the Columbia disaster, was named, his last name was Husband. His name was Rick Husband. And so that's tied in with the number 107. So I find that's interesting. We have this number 107 in the mission number. We have this man whose last name is Husband in this disaster. And then you look at Charlie Kirk. Kirk means church. And who is the bride of Christ? Church, the church. So his name is related to the bride of Christ, and he also has the number 107 connected to his death, in that it's 107 days from his death to Christmas Day, a day that Jesus is celebrated, Jesus who is the groom. So the man whose last name points to the bride, 107 days to a holiday that's celebrating the groom, Jesus, the bridegroom. And you have 107 in this Columbia disaster, and the man's last name, that was the commander of that mission, was Husband. So I find that very interesting. And you think all this is a coincidence? I don't. Now here's something amazing to add to all this. In the same month that Charlie Kirk was tragically killed, this number 107 was splashed over the news for a completely different story. But at the same time, this number 107 was prominently in the public eye because Kamala Harris, who ran for president, former vice president, she came out with a book, and it just happened to be called 107 Days. That references the length of her presidential campaign in 2024 that spanned from 7/21 to 11/5 election day. And it's like God is trying to get our attention here to show us that this number 107 was important at this time. And now you see why. It ties into Charlie Kirk, ties into the two witnesses, it ties into the Twin Towers, and ties into the bride of Christ. And we were just talking about Kamala Harris. Jonathan Cahn actually came out with a book called The Avatar, which I also recommend buying and reading. And he talks about Kamala Harris and other political figures and prophetic symbolism, and ties in with these figures, major figures that are on the scene today. Okay. But let's talk about what he said in his video about Charlie Kirk. So he pointed out that it was reported in the news that 2 days before Charlie Kirk's death, a woman who is associated with the organization called Jezebel, which is, I guess it's a self-proclaimed feminist organization that has, I believe, a publication. And this person who, I guess, works for Jezebel, or is part of this group, Jezebel, and writes for them, wrote about hiring a witch on Etsy to curse Charlie Kirk. And this happened 2 days before his death. So, as Jonathan Cahn pointed out, Jezebel in the Bible was the wife of King Ahab, a high priestess of Baal. Jezebel threatens to kill Elijah. And this is when Elijah heads south and ends up in a cave in Horeb. Horeb. Okay. So we can tie Charlie Kirk to Elijah. So if you read in Revelation, let's read in Revelation about these two witnesses. Many people point out how it relates to Elijah, because Elijah stopped the rain for 3.5 years. By the way, there's another 3.5 or 3.5 associated with all this. It was 3.5 years that rain was stopped. He instigated that. The main thing is most people agree that one of the witnesses is either the actual Elijah back or somebody coming in the spirit and power of Elijah. Okay, that's the main point I want to make. And by the way, I want to emphasize that Charlie Kirk did not die because of this curse. Because the scripture says that what God has blessed can't be cursed. That's Genesis 22:12. But I believe that God allowed this incident to happen so close to Kirk's death, this witch's curse, and become public knowledge so that we could see this prophetic connection. I think that's the reason. Okay. There's one more way that Charlie Kirk and his death is a foreshadowing of the two witnesses to come. But after Charlie's death, we saw a very kind of disgusting thing. There were actually people going on social media and other places actually celebrating his death. They were happy, they were gleeful, they were partying, they were dancing. Now, this didn't happen on a large scale. It was on a small scale. The fact that it happened at all is disgusting. And this is not something that would happen decades ago. People would not have reacted like this. And if they really felt that way, they would have kept it to themselves. Now people are just bold as to celebrate the cold-blooded murder of another human being who had a wife and two small children. I mean, it's terrible that people did that. But this is prophetic foreshadowing, because what does the Bible say happens when the two witnesses are killed? Let's read it. So when the two witnesses are killed, almost the whole world celebrates, and then people are exchanging gifts and they're celebrating and they're happy. So that happens on a much, 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 much larger scale than Charlie Kirk, but you see this interesting little, what looks like foreshadowing. And that you just add it with all the other evidence. And I believe it's very clear that Charlie Kirk's assassination was symbolic of events that are going to happen. And it shows a couple of things, this event. And it shows that, A, these things are really going to happen. They are real events. They're not, oh, God's going to be victorious, but there's no real two witnesses, and there's no Antichrist, and there's no 7-year tribulation, like some Christians believe. They take all the prophetic things about the end times, and they just make it into nothing. And say, well, it just means that God's in control, and everything's going to work out. And these aren't really future events that are going to happen. Well, that's a bunch of nonsense. That's a terrible way to look at it. Or some people are preterists and say, all these events already happened, and it just pointed to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, blah, blah, blah. Well, that doesn't fit whatsoever. It's showing that these two witnesses are really going to come, and they're really going to be killed, for one thing. And there really will be persecution of Christians and Jews, and the nation of Israel will be attacked. These things will be real, and plus they're going to happen soon. That's what I think Charlie's death is prophetic of. Very important is that really Charlie's death sparked this movement. The faith side of it, the faith side of the turning point is growing. That's the most important to me, the faith side of that. And it's sparking kind of, beginning stages of a revival, really. Okay, that's it. That's actually only about half of the stuff I have of the prophetic signs associated with Charlie Kirk's assassination. I have more on that and many more things along the same lines with other recent or semi-recent events that have, prophetic signs connected to them. They're in a book I'm finishing up writing. So it's been a little over 2 years since my last videos, and I think I mentioned in one of them that I was looking for a publisher for my book. Well, so much has happened in the world in the last 2 years since that time, which was, I think, about September 2023 I had those videos out. But so much has happened, like October 7th, and all the stuff with Israel fighting her enemies like Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran, the presidential election, and just a bunch of other stuff. So I just kept adding more and more stuff to the book. But I can't just keep adding more and more. I've got to try to get this book out. So I'm committed to trying to get it out next year, especially in the first half of the year, because, time is short. I'd like to find a traditional publisher that publishes Christian prophecy books, but a lot of them will not take unsolicited manuscripts. You got to try to find an agent to represent the book, which is not easy for a first-time author. Another route could be a hybrid publisher, or even what it used to be called vanity publishers, where you pay a certain amount, usually between $2,000 to $7,000. You give them, and they'll help put the book out for you. Well, I don't really have that kind of money right now, but if I needed it, God would provide it some way. So that would be second option. Third option would be self-publishing. I did self-publish a small book a number of years ago as more of a trial than anything else, but just to see what it entailed. But after that experience, that would be my last option. But the book needs to come out. Like I said, I want to get it out next year, hopefully in the first half of the year, one way or the other. All right, that's it. I don't know if I'll make any other videos in the near future. I guess I'll just see how it goes. But I do thank you for watching to the end, and God bless.